Step out of the vehicle now. The words cut through the quiet hum of the gas station like a blade, sharp, certain, unquestioned. Under the pale yellow glow of overhead lights, the black SUV sat perfectly still beside pump number 4, its polished surface reflecting the flicker of neon signs and passing headlights. The night was calm, almost too calm, the kind of stillness that makes every sound feel louder than it should be. Aaliyah Carter stepped out slowly, her movements controlled, deliberate, her heels touching the concrete with soft, measured clicks. She didn't rush. She didn't argue. She simply stood there, one hand resting lightly against the side of her vehicle, her expression composed, unreadable. Imagine standing there, surrounded by strangers, feeling every pair of eyes turned toward you, not because of what you did, but because of what they assume you are. Officer Daniel Brooks approached with the kind of confidence that came from years of never being questioned, his posture rigid, his hand resting near his belt as his flashlight beam traced across the vehicle, then up to her face. He didn't greet her. He didn't ask if everything was okay. Instead, he looked at the SUV, then back at her, a faint smirk forming like he had already decided how this was going to end. "License and registration," he said, his tone flat, but edged with something colder, something heavier than routine. Around them, the station carried on, but not really. A man by the air pump slowed his movements. A couple near the convenience store door paused mid-conversation. Even the cashier behind the glass seemed to glance up, sensing the shift in the air. Aaliyah reached into her purse calmly, her fingers steady, her breathing even. She had been here before. Not this exact place, not this exact moment, but this feeling. The quiet judgment. The unspoken question hanging in the air like a weight no one wanted to name. Brooks took a step closer, the beam of his flashlight now fixed on her hands, watching every movement like it confirmed something he already believed. "Is this your vehicle?" he asked, tilting his head slightly, his voice louder now, just enough for others to hear. The question lingered longer than it should have, not because it needed an answer, but because of what it implied. Aaliyah looked up at him, her eyes steady, unshaken. "Yes, officer," she replied, her voice calm, controlled, almost quiet against the tension building around them. He exhaled through his nose, a short, dismissive sound, glancing back at the SUV as if it contradicted her very existence. "Funny," he muttered, just loud enough. "We've had reports of vehicles like this being involved in suspicious activity." The words hung in the air, vague enough to sound official, pointed enough to land exactly where he intended. Aaliyah said nothing. She didn't need to, because sometimes silence speaks louder than defense. The soft buzz of fluorescent lights above them filled the gap, a low electric hum that seemed to stretch the moment longer than it should. Somewhere in the distance, a car door slammed. Closer now, a phone lifted quietly, its camera pointed in their direction. Brooks didn't notice, or maybe he didn't care. He took another step forward, closing the distance, his presence looming, his authority filling the space between them. "Step over here," he instructed, gesturing toward the front of the vehicle. His voice was firmer now, sharper, the kind that expected compliance without question. Aaliyah moved exactly as told, her steps slow, measured, her posture unchanged. No resistance, no fear, just control. But behind that calm exterior, something else was settling into place. Not anger, not panic, something quieter, something patient. Because what Officer Brooks didn't know, what no one standing there under those flickering lights understood, was that this moment wasn't just another routine stop. It wasn't just another assumption made in the dark. It was the beginning of something that would not stay contained within the boundaries of that gas station. And as the night held its breath, as the quiet tension thickened and every eye remained fixed on the scene unfolding, the truth waited, just beneath the surface, silent, unshaken, and far more powerful than anything a badge alone could command. The beam of the flashlight did not move from her face, not even for a second, as if holding it there long enough might reveal something hidden, something that justified everything already forming in his mind. And Officer Brooks narrowed his eyes slightly, studying her in silence before speaking again, slower this time, like he wanted every word to land exactly where it hurt. "Mind telling me where you are coming from tonight?" The question sounded simple, routine even, but the tone beneath it carried weight, suspicion. wrapped in politeness that never quite reached his eyes, and Aaliyah could feel it. The way people nearby leaned in just a little more, the way conversations around them faded into a quiet background hum, replaced by attention that was no longer subtle, no longer hidden, just waiting, watching, deciding. She answered without hesitation, her voice steady. I am coming from downtown. Nothing more, nothing less, because she understood something most people in that situation did not. That over-explaining never changed the outcome when the conclusion had already been written. Brooks gave a small nod, but it was not agreement. It was confirmation, like her answer fit neatly into whatever story he had already built, and he shifted his stance, circling slightly toward the driver's side door, his flashlight now sweeping across the interior, lingering on the dashboard, the seats, the details that made the vehicle what it was, clean, well kept, undeniably expensive. Step away from the vehicle, he said, firmer now, his voice carrying just enough authority to make it clear this was no longer a request, and for a brief moment, the entire space seemed to tighten, like the air itself was pulling inward. Imagine standing there, knowing you have done nothing wrong, yet every instruction feels like it is pulling you deeper into something you never asked to be part of. Aaliyah stepped back exactly as instructed, her movements precise, controlled, her expression unchanged, but her eyes followed him, not with fear, not with anger, but with awareness, the kind that comes from understanding that moments like this rarely stay small. Brooks leaned slightly, peering through the window, his reflection faint against the glass, and then he straightened, exhaling as he turned back toward her, his lips pressing into a thin line. You said this is your vehicle, he repeated, louder this time, enough for those nearby to hear clearly, and a man by the pump 2 spots overshifted his weight, pretending to check his phone while his camera remained angled just right. Aaliyah met Brooks's gaze again, her voice calm, almost quiet against the growing tension. Yes, officer, it is, and for a split second, something flickered across his face, not doubt, but irritation, like her composure was not the reaction he expected, not the one he was used to controlling. He took a step closer again, closing the space deliberately, his presence pressing forward. Then you will not mind if I take a closer look, he said. The statement framed as a question that did not actually offer a choice, and the silence that followed stretched longer than it should have. Thick, heavy, filled with the unspoken understanding of what was really happening. Somewhere behind them, the soft chime of the gas pump clicked off, unnoticed, irrelevant to the moment unfolding. Aaliyah's fingers tightened slightly around the strap of her purse, not in fear, but in restraint, and when she spoke, her voice remained even, measured, carrying a quiet weight that did not need volume to be heard. Officer, is there a specific reason for this stop? The question hung in the air, simple, direct, but it shifted something, subtle but undeniable, because now the attention was not just on her, it was on him, on the answer he would have to give, on the line between authority and justification. Brooks paused, just for a fraction of a second, and in that pause, the night seemed to hold its breath, the flickering lights above casting long shadows across the pavement, stretching the moment into something bigger than either of them. He cleared his throat, adjusting his stance, his voice sharper now. I already told you. There have been reports, but the words did not land the same way they had before, not with the same certainty, not with the same control, because something had shifted, something quiet but powerful, and as more phones subtly lifted, as more eyes locked onto the scene, what had started as a simple stop was no longer contained, no longer private. It was becoming something else entirely, something that would not be easily dismissed, and still, through all of it, Aaliyah Carter remained exactly where she stood, calm, unshaken, and waiting, not for permission, not for understanding, but for the moment when the truth would no longer need to stay hidden. The silence after his answer did not fade. It deepened, stretching across the concrete like a shadow that refused to move, and for the first time since he stepped out of his patrol car, Officer Brooks was no longer the only one in control of the moment, because now there were witnesses, not just people passing by, but eyes that lingered, phones that stayed raised a second longer than necessary, attention that no longer belonged to him. Alone, he shifted his weight again, subtle, almost unnoticeable, but enough to betray the slightest crack in the certainty he had carried just moments ago. And still, he pressed forward, because that was what he knew, what he had always done when faced with resistance that did not look like resistance at all. "I am going to need you to unlock the vehicle," he said, his tone sharper now, more direct, like he wanted to reclaim the space that had quietly slipped from his grip. Aaliyah did not move right away, not because she was refusing, but because she understood the weight of timing, the power of a pause, the way a single second could shift the entire direction of what came next. Her eyes moved briefly, not toward him, but past him, taking in the reflection of red and blue lights across the glossy surface of her SUV, the faint outline of figures standing just far enough to pretend they were not involved, and the small blinking red light of a camera recording everything without interruption. Imagine knowing that every word spoken, every gesture made, is no longer temporary, that it will exist beyond this moment, beyond this place, beyond his control. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, steady, carrying something deeper than compliance. "Officer, I would like to understand the legal basis for that request." And the words landed differently than anything she had said before, not louder, not aggressive, but precise, intentional, like a line drawn clearly in the sand. Brooks's jaw tightened slightly, his gaze narrowing as he looked at her, really looked this time, not just at her face, not just at the car, but at the way she stood, the way she spoke, the way she did not bend under the weight of his authority the way others often did. For a brief second, the rhythm of the moment broke. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. A car pulled into the station and slowed as the driver took in the scene. Somewhere, a phone notification chimed, quickly silenced. And then Brooks took another step forward, closing the gap once more, his voice lower now, more controlled, but edged with something that had not been there before, something closer to frustration. "If you have nothing to hide, then this should not be a problem," he said, each word deliberate, each syllable placed carefully, as if repeating a line he had used many times before, a line that had always worked. But tonight, something was different. Aaliyah held his gaze, unflinching, her expression unchanged, but there was a shift now, subtle, almost invisible, like the calm before something inevitable. She did not raise her voice. She did not argue. Instead, she reached slowly into her purse again, her movements deliberate, measured, every action visible, every motion transparent. Brooks's attention locked onto her hand immediately, his posture tightening, his focus narrowing to that single point, as if whatever she was about to reveal would either confirm everything he believed or unravel it entirely. The air felt heavier now, thicker, like the moment itself was pressing down on everyone standing within it. She paused, just briefly, her fingers resting against the edge of something inside her bag, and in that pause, the world seemed to hold still. The hum of the lights, the distant sound of traffic, the quiet shuffle of feet nearby, all of it faded into the background as attention sharpened, focused, waiting. Because what Officer Brooks still did not realize, what the small crowd gathering under those flickering lights had not yet understood, was that this moment was no longer about a vehicle, no longer about suspicion, no longer about control. It was about to become something else entirely, something that could not be undone, something that would follow him far beyond this gas station, far beyond this night. And as Aaliyah Carter's hand finally closed around the item inside her purse, her voice remained as calm as ever, carrying no anger, no fear, only certainty, the kind that does not need to announce itself to be felt. Her fingers closed around the edge of a slim leather holder, and for a brief moment, she did not pull it out. She simply held it there, letting the weight of the moment settle, letting the silence stretch just a second longer than comfortable, because sometimes the space before the truth matters just as much as the truth itself. Officer Brooks watched closely, his eyes locked on her hand, his posture rigid, the beam of his flashlight unmoving as if it could pin the moment in place. And around them, the quiet murmur of the gas station had completely faded, replaced by a stillness that felt almost deliberate, like everyone present understood that something was about to shift, even if they could not yet name it. Then, slowly, without hesitation, Aaliyah pulled the holder free and opened it with calm precision, turning it just enough so the contents were visible, not dramatically, not forcefully, but clearly, undeniably. The reflection of the overhead lights caught the edge of the badge inside, a subtle gleam against the dark leather, and for the first time since the stop began, Officer Brooks did not speak. He looked at it, really looked at it, and in that moment, something changed. It was not loud. It was not sudden. It was quiet, internal, like a realization that arrives without permission. His shoulders stiffened slightly, his grip on the flashlight tightening just a fraction, and the confidence that had filled his stance only minutes ago no longer sat the same way. Aaliyah's voice came next, steady, even, carrying no trace of anger, only clarity. "My name is Aaliyah Carter," she said, her eyes meeting his directly. "Unwavering, federal district judge." The words did not echo, but they did not need to. They landed exactly where they were meant to, and the effect was immediate, not in volume, but in absence, because the space around them fell completely silent. Imagine realizing, in a single instant, that the situation you believed you controlled has already moved beyond your reach. Brooks blinked once, then again, as if his mind needed a second to catch up with what his eyes were seeing, what his ears had just heard, and for the first time, there was no immediate response, no quick command, no rehearsed line to regain control. The man by the pump lowered his phone slightly, but he did not stop recording. The couple near the store stood frozen, their earlier conversation forgotten. Even the hum of the lights seemed quieter, as if the entire scene had been paused. Brooks cleared his throat, a small, almost involuntary sound, and shifted his stance, taking a half step back without fully realizing it. The distance between them no longer something he was closing, but something that had quietly been established. "Judge?" he repeated, the word unfamiliar on his tongue in this context, as if it did not belong in this setting, under these lights, in this moment he had shaped so differently in his mind. Aaliyah closed the holder gently, not snapping it shut, not making a point, just ending the reveal with the same calm control she had carried from the beginning, and she did not move closer, did not press forward, because she did not need to. The shift had already happened. The power in the moment no longer came from raised voices or commands. It came from truth, simple and undeniable. "Yes," she said quietly, her tone unchanged. "And I asked you a question, officer." The words were not louder than before, but they carried more weight now, not because of volume, but because of what had just been revealed. Brooks's gaze flickered briefly, not away, but around, as if for the first time he was aware of the eyes on him. The phone still raised, the presence of witnesses who were no longer passive, and the realization settled in slowly, heavily, that this was no longer a private interaction, no longer something that could be dismissed or explained away with a few words. The narrative had shifted, and it was no longer his to control. Aaliyah stood exactly where she had been from the start, composed, steady, her posture unchanged, but the space around her felt different now, not because she had become something new, but because what she was had finally been seen, and as the silence stretched once more, thicker than before, the night itself seemed to wait, because what came next would not just determine the end of this moment, it would define everything that followed. The word hung in the air longer than it should have. "Judge," echoing not in sound but in consequence, and Officer Brooks felt it settle in his chest like something heavy, something immovable, the kind of realization that does not arrive all at once, but unfolds piece by piece, each second making it harder to pretend nothing had changed. He straightened slightly, instinctively, as if posture alone could restore the authority he had carried into this moment. But it did not land the same way now, not under the quiet weight of watching eyes and steady cameras. "Ma'am," he corrected himself quickly, the shift in tone subtle but undeniable, the edge in his voice replaced with something more careful, more measured. I was responding to a report." The sentence trailed just slightly at the end, not unfinished, but uncertain, like it no longer held the same strength it once did. Aaliyah watched him without interruption, her expression unchanged, her silence no longer passive but deliberate, giving him space not to control the situation, but to reveal it. Imagine being in that position, where every word you say no longer shapes the outcome, but exposes it. Brooks glanced briefly toward the surrounding area, noticing now what he had ignored before. The phone still raised, the subtle angles of people pretending to stand casually while capturing everything. the quiet attention that had turned this encounter into something far larger than a routine stop. He cleared his throat again, adjusting his grip on the flashlight before lowering it slightly, the beam no longer fixed on her, no longer interrogating, just there. There have been incidents, he continued, trying to reassemble the narrative, vehicles matching this description involved in suspicious activity. The explanation sounded thinner now, stretched, less convincing even to his own ears, and for a moment, the only response was the soft hum of the gas station lights and the distant sound of traffic moving steadily down the road. Aaliyah finally spoke, her voice calm, steady, but now carrying a clarity that cut through the uncertainty. What specific incident, officer? The question was simple, direct, but it landed with precision, removing any room for vagueness, for general statements, for assumptions dressed as facts. Brooks hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, but it was enough for the pause to be noticed, enough for the shift to become visible, and in that brief silence, the balance tilted further, quietly but definitively. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, his eyes flicking once more toward the small crowd, toward the reality that this moment was no longer contained, no longer controlled. I would need to verify that, he admitted, the words coming slower now, less certain, and the admission itself carried more weight than anything he had said before. Aaliyah nodded slightly, not in approval, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, like she had expected exactly that answer, like this moment was unfolding precisely as it needed to. So at this time, she continued, her tone even, composed, there is no confirmed report tied to my vehicle. It was not a question, and that was what made it land harder, because it did not invite denial, it did not allow deflection, it simply stated what was now evident to everyone standing there. Brooks exhaled quietly, the tension in his shoulders shifting, not disappearing, but changing, and for the first time, the authority he had relied on did not feel like protection, it felt like exposure. The man with the phone adjusted his grip, zooming slightly, capturing the exchange more clearly now, and somewhere behind them, the soft click of another camera joined in, subtle but unmistakable. Brooks ran a hand briefly along his jaw, a gesture that might have gone unnoticed minutes ago, but now stood out, a sign of uncertainty, of recalibration. Ma'am, he said again, choosing his words carefully. You understand I am just doing my job. The sentence was familiar, almost rehearsed, but tonight it did not carry the same reassurance. Not in this context, not after everything that had already been set into motion. Aaliyah held his gaze, her expression steady, her voice quiet but firm. And I understand the law, officer. The words settled between them, simple, unembellished, but final in a way that did not need emphasis, because the truth had already taken its place. And as the night continued to hold its breath around them, one thing had become unmistakably clear. This was no longer about a stop. It was about accountability, and that was something no badge alone could control. The words did not need to be repeated to be understood. They settled into the space between them with quiet finality. And for a moment, Officer Brooks had nothing to add, nothing immediate to counter with, because the ground he had been standing on since the beginning of this encounter had shifted in a way he could no longer ignore. He nodded once, slowly, more to himself than to her, as if acknowledging something he could not undo, and then he took a small step back, creating space where before he had closed it without hesitation. The flashlight lowered fully now, no longer a tool of scrutiny, just an object in his hand, and the beam drifted toward the pavement, illuminating nothing of importance. Around them, the stillness remained, but it had changed, no longer tense in anticipation, but heavy with realization. The people watching were no longer wondering what would happen next, they were waiting to see how it would end. Brooks glanced briefly toward the patrol car, then back at Aaliyah, his expression more controlled now, but the certainty that once defined it had faded into something more cautious, more deliberate. Ma'am, he began again, choosing his words carefully, I am going to conclude this stop. The sentence was simple, straightforward, but it carried an unspoken admission, one that did not need to be voiced to be understood. Aaliyah did not respond immediately. She simply watched him, her posture unchanged, her presence steady, as if allowing him the space to reach that conclusion on his own terms, even though the outcome had already been set into motion. Imagine being in that moment, where the decision you present as yours was never truly yours to begin with. Brooks shifted his weight again, his eyes flickering once more toward the surrounding faces, the phone still raised, the quiet witnesses who had transformed this interaction into something that would not disappear when the night ended. He adjusted his uniform slightly, a small, almost reflexive motion, and then added, "You are free to go." The words were familiar, routine, but tonight they did not carry the same authority, not after everything that had unfolded, not after the line between assumption and accountability had been drawn so clearly. Aaliyah inclined her head just slightly, not in gratitude, not in submission, but in acknowledgement, as if recognizing the statement for what it was, an ending that had come later than it should have, but one that had finally arrived. She turned toward her vehicle, her movements calm, unhurried, her hand resting briefly against the door before opening it, and for a moment, it seemed as though the scene might dissolve into normalcy, into the quiet routine of a night that would otherwise go unnoticed. But the presence of the cameras, the stillness of the watchers, the weight of what had just occurred lingered in the air, refusing to be dismissed so easily. Brooks remained where he stood, watching her, his expression unreadable now, caught somewhere between relief and something else, something heavier, something that would not fade as quickly. He opened his mouth slightly, as if to say something more, perhaps to clarify, perhaps to regain some part of the narrative, but the words did not come, and instead, he closed it again, the moment passing without sound. Aaliyah paused just before stepping into the driver's seat, her hand still on the door, and she turned her head slightly, not fully facing him, but enough for her voice to carry clearly across the space between them. "Officer," she said, her tone calm, even, but now carrying a quiet weight that had not been there before. "This interaction will be reviewed." It was not a threat. It was not raised in volume. It was simply a statement, precise and unambiguous, and it landed with a certainty that no explanation could soften. Brooks's posture stiffened slightly, the meaning settling in immediately, and for the first time since the stop began, the realization extended beyond the moment itself, beyond the gas station, beyond the night. This was not ending here. Aaliyah entered the vehicle, the door closing with a soft, controlled sound, and as the engine started, the low hum filled the silence that had stretched for far too long. The headlights illuminated the pavement ahead, steady and clear, and as the SUV pulled away from pump number 4, the scene did not return to what it had been before. The people remained where they were for a moment longer, their phones lowering slowly, their expressions thoughtful, aware that they had just witnessed something that would not remain contained within this space. Brooks stood still, the fading taillights reflecting briefly in his eyes, and as the night resumed its quiet rhythm, one truth remained, unspoken but undeniable: some moments do not end when they appear to, they begin. The red glow of the taillights disappeared into the distance, fading beyond the edge of the gas station lot. But the moment did not fade with it. It lingered, hanging in the air like something unfinished, something that had only just begun to take shape. Officer Brooks remained standing exactly where he was, his posture rigid at first, then slowly loosening as the reality of what had just happened settled in piece by piece, not all at once, but enough to make the silence around him feel heavier than before. The low hum of the overhead lights returned, steady and indifferent, and the distant sound of traffic resumed its quiet rhythm. But for Brooks, everything felt slightly out of place, like the night had shifted just enough that it could not return to what it had been. He turned toward his patrol car, his movements slower now, less certain, and as he reached for the door handle, he paused, his reflection faint in the window, the outline of his uniform sharp against the dim glow. Imagine realizing that a moment you thought was routine has already moved beyond your control, that it is no longer contained within your version of events. Behind him, the small group of onlookers began to disperse, but not completely, not immediately, because something had changed for them too, something they would carry beyond this place, beyond this night. A man near the pump glanced down at his phone, his thumb hovering over the screen, replaying the footage he had just captured, the scene unfolding again in silent repetition, each detail clearer now than it had been in real time. Another person stepped aside, speaking quietly into their phone, their voice low but urgent. as if trying to describe something they had not expected to witness. Brooks opened the door to his patrol car and sat inside. The interior dim, illuminated only by the soft glow of the dashboard lights. And for a moment, he did nothing, his hands resting on the steering wheel, his eyes fixed forward, not on the road, but on something else entirely, something internal, something that did not resolve as easily as a report or a shift change. The radio crackled softly beside him, a routine dispatch breaking through the quiet, but he did not respond right away, his focus elsewhere, on the words that had followed him even after she had driven away. This interaction will be reviewed. They echoed now, not loudly, but persistently, each repetition carrying more weight than the last. He exhaled slowly, leaning back in the seat, his jaw tightening slightly as the realization expanded, stretching beyond the gas station, beyond the presence of those few witnesses, into something far wider, something he could not see yet, but could already feel approaching. Outside, the station returned to motion, cars pulling in and out, doors opening and closing, the ordinary rhythm of the night continuing as if nothing had happened. But beneath that surface, something had shifted, something that would not remain hidden for long. Aaliyah drove steadily down the road, the city lights reflecting across her windshield, her hands steady on the wheel, her expression calm, unchanged, but her mind already moving forward, not back. This was not new to her, not unfamiliar, but it was not something she ignored either, because moments like this were never isolated, they were part of something larger, something that required attention, not reaction. She reached the next intersection and slowed as the light turned red, the soft glow illuminating the interior of her vehicle, and for a brief moment, she glanced at the reflection of herself in the glass, not searching, not questioning, just acknowledging, before her gaze returned to the road ahead. Somewhere, miles away, a phone screen lit up with a notification, a video beginning to upload, a title forming, a moment captured and shared, and as the first few views appeared, small and insignificant on their own, the reach of what had happened quietly began to extend, moving beyond the limits of that gas station, beyond the boundaries of a single night. Back in the patrol car, Brooks finally reached for the radio, his voice steady but lower than before as he checked in, the routine words sounding different now, carrying a weight they had not held earlier, and as he pulled out of the lot, the flashing lights reflecting briefly across the pavement, one truth settled in with quiet certainty: some actions do not end when the moment passes. They follow, they grow, and eventually, they return. By the time the sun began to rise, the moment that had unfolded under those dim gas station lights no longer belonged to the night. It had already found its way into the morning, into screens, into conversations, into places neither of them could control, and the video, shaky at first but clear enough to capture every word, every pause, every shift in tone, was already being watched, shared, replayed. It started quietly, a few views, a few comments, but moments like that do not stay small for long, especially when the silence inside them speaks louder than anything else. Imagine waking up and realizing that something you thought would disappear with time is now being seen by thousands, then tens of thousands, each person forming their own understanding of what happened, each replay sharpening the details you cannot take back. Officer Brooks sat in the briefing room that morning, the fluorescent lights overhead harsher than usual, casting sharp shadows across the walls as the low murmur of voices filled the space. But today, the conversation was not routine, it was focused, controlled, and directed at something very specific. His name had already been mentioned before he walked in. The room did not fall silent when he entered, but it changed, the tone shifting just enough for him to feel it, the glances that lingered a second longer than necessary, the quiet acknowledgement that something had happened, something that could not be ignored. His supervisor stood near the front, a tablet in hand, the screen angled slightly away, but not enough to hide the paused frame, the image unmistakable even from a distance, the gas station lights, the SUV, the moment frozen in time. "We need to talk about this," the supervisor said, his voice even, controlled, but firm in a way that left no room for misunderstanding. Brooks nodded once, his posture straight, his expression composed, but inside, the weight of the situation had already begun to settle, not fully, not completely, but enough to make every second feel longer than it should. Across town, In a quiet office lined with dark wood and soft lighting, Aaliyah Carter sat at her desk, the early morning sun filtering through the window, casting a warm glow that contrasted with the weight of the documents laid out in front of her. The video played again on the screen, not because she needed to see it, not because she had not already experienced it, but because documentation matters, details matter, and moments like that are not handled with emotion, they are handled with precision. She paused the video at a specific frame, her eyes steady, her expression unchanged, and then she reached for a file beside her, one that had been building long before that night, one that now had something new to add. The words spoken at the gas station were no longer just words, they were evidence, context, part of a larger pattern that did not begin there and would not end there. Back in the station, Brooks sat across from his supervisor now, the tablet placed between them, the video playing without sound, but it did not need sound. The images were enough, the sequence clear, the progression undeniable. This is already out there, the supervisor said, tapping the screen lightly, and it is gaining attention. Brooks watched, his jaw tightening slightly as he saw himself from the outside. The posture, the approach, the moment where everything shifted, and for the first time, it was not just memory, it was perspective, something he could not control, something he could not reframe. I was responding to a report, he said, his voice steady, but quieter than before, as if repeating it here did not carry the same certainty it once had. The supervisor did not respond immediately, instead letting the video continue for a few more seconds before pausing it again, the frame settling on the moment the badge was revealed. The room felt smaller then, tighter, as if the space itself was closing in around the reality of what had been captured. Outside, the world continued as it always does, cars moving, people working, the rhythm of the day unchanged on the surface, but beneath it, something had shifted, something that would not simply fade with time. Because moments like that, once seen, once understood, do not disappear, they expand, they connect, and eventually, they demand an answer. And as the screen in front of Brooks went still, frozen on that single undeniable frame, one truth became impossible to ignore. What happened that night was no longer just his version of events. It belonged to everyone who had seen it, and that changed everything. The room remained quiet long after the video stopped playing, not because there was nothing left to say, but because everything that needed to be understood was already there, frozen on the screen, undeniable, unchangeable. And for Officer Brooks, the weight of that realization no longer felt distant or abstract. It felt immediate, personal, and impossible to step away from. His supervisor leaned back slightly, folding his arms, his expression measured, not angry, not emotional, but firm in a way that carried far more consequence than raised voices ever could. "This is under formal review," he said, his tone steady, leaving no room for interpretation, and the words settled into the space like a line drawn clearly between what had been and what would follow. Brooks nodded once, slowly, his posture still straight, but the certainty that once defined him had been replaced by something else, something quieter, something that did not offer easy answers. Imagine realizing that the moment you thought would pass unnoticed has now become the moment that defines everything that comes next. Across the city, Aaliyah Carter closed the file in front of her with calm precision, the soft sound of paper meeting paper marking the end of review, not the end of action, and she sat still for a moment, her hands resting lightly on the desk, her expression composed, not satisfied, not emotional, but resolved. This was never about a single stop, never about a single officer. It was about something larger, something that required clarity, accountability, and a system that answered to its own standards. She reached for another document, one already prepared, one that outlined the next step not as a reaction, but as a process, measured, deliberate, and grounded in law. Back at the station, the conversation had shifted from explanation to procedure, from justification to consequence, and Brooks listened as the details were laid out, each word precise, each step defined, the process moving forward regardless of how he felt about it. Outside, the story continued to spread, no longer just a video, but a conversation, a question, a moment that people replayed not just to see what happened, but to understand what it meant. Phones lit up across different cities, different states, The same scene appearing on different screens, the same silence, the same shift, the same realization unfolding again and again. Days passed, but the moment did not fade. It evolved, moving from attention to action, from reaction to resolution. And when the final decision came, it did not arrive with noise, it arrived with clarity, structured, official, documented. Brooks stood in the same uniform he had worn that night, but it did not feel the same. The weight of it different now, the meaning altered by everything that had followed. And as the outcome was delivered, there was no argument, no interruption, just the quiet acknowledgement that what had been set in motion had reached its inevitable point. Across the city, Aaliyah walked through the courthouse, the familiar sound of footsteps echoing softly along polished floors, her presence steady, unchanged, because for her, this was not a victory, not something to celebrate, but something necessary, something that reinforced a truth she had always known. Justice does not raise its voice. It does not rush. It waits, it builds, and when it arrives, it does so with certainty. Imagine standing on one side of that truth, believing you control it, only to realize it was never yours to command. The gas station returned to its ordinary rhythm, cars coming and going, lights flickering the same way they always had. But the moment that took place there did not disappear with time. It remained, not in the concrete or the air, but in the people who had seen it, who had shared it, who had understood it. Because in the end, it was never just about a stop, never just about a question asked under artificial lights. It was about what happens when assumption meets truth, when power meets accountability, and when silence is finally replaced by something that cannot be ignored. He thought authority came from the badge he wore, but that night, under those lights, he learned something else entirely. Authority can